notions of universal justice. Very few people, 2,400 people in all in Europe, 3,000 in Saudi Arabia, less in other places of the world, have actually committed themselves in some way to violence. It's a very small proportion. And you know what the greatest predictor is of who will commit violence versus who won't? Does anybody have any idea? What? No. The greatest predictor is whether they play soccer together. Whether they play soccer together, whether they're pinball buddies, whether they're bodybuilding buddies, whether they're friends. No one ever does it alone. Okay? And as far as violence is concerned, we did studies. So far as I know, the only studies of humiliation, people who are humiliated don't commit violence. They're cowed. People believe they're responding because others they may love or be committed to, they feel are humiliated. But people who are humiliated don't commit violence. We regularly find a negative correlation between them.
What about Ted Kaczynski?
Ted Kaczynski is a loner. He has nothing.
That's what I mean. You were talking about people being violent.
Yeah, he's a crackpot loner.
Okay.
These people have no criminal records to speak of, fairly well educated. Poverty isn't a big factor. They span the normal distribution. There's nothing in their individual psyches that's different from any of us. Okay? It really has nothing to do with individual personality factors. It has to do with the small group dynamics, the patterns of friendship and of kinship and of neighborhood and of common activities which determine who will join the jihad and whether or not they'll make attacks. It's not about hierarchical organization, command and control, recruitment or brainwashing. There's none of that. There's no brainwashing in the jihad. It's about fairly flat and fluid networks of friends, families, neighbors, schoolmates, workmates, soccer buddies, camp buddies, bodybuilding buddies, and pinball buddies, who self-radicalize in groups and go looking for Al-Qaeda. And I'm going to give you some case studies, some of the sort of famous case studies. This notion that there are cells, you hear guys like George Tenet or the president or anyone else talking about sleeper cells. Does anybody have any idea how many sleeper cells there's been in the United States? Okay. There's been exactly one sleeper cell in the history of the United States. And that was Colonel Rudolf Abel, who was sent by the Russians in the 1950s and then exchanged for Francis Gary Powers, who was shot down in a U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. That's it. That's the only sleeper cell that's ever existed. Again, this is pretty much a fantasy. And this notion that there's cells, there's command and control, there's hierarchies, there's bureaus, there's offices, there's the chief of military planning, there's the chief of operations. This is simple bureaucratic mirroring by people who know nothing other than their own bureaucratic lives, who don't see things other than through the lenses of their own lives. I get it from everybody. This is, what the Moroccan police give. I can give you what the Saudis give me, what the Indonesians give me. Basically, bureaucrats interpret the world in terms of bureaucracies, okay, with structures and hierarchies and all this. Has nothing to do with it, which makes it a hard problem to deal with. If these are the guys you entrust to deal with the problem. Same thing with Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Basically, this new range of attacks in North Africa is guys who applied to Zawahiri and bin Laden to become Al-Qaeda. They had problems with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and the Groupe Salafiste pour la Prédication de l'Islam and the other North African groups were always in conflict. But it's a big logo now. Zarqawi himself, he was a competitor of bin Laden. There was no love lost between them. But it's such a big brand name now. Everybody wants to belong to it. So they applied. It took about 6 months for the word to actually get into the frontier regions. And then, bin Laden's over here said, okay, call yourselves Al-Qaeda. And all of a sudden there's Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. They do a suicide attack for the first time, and the headlines across the world is Al-Qaeda in North Africa. But again, basically, they've got the consent of somebody to use a brand name. Same with Europe. Let me just go through a couple of examples. One is the Jamaat Islamiyah. This is a very interesting organization. It's an outgrowth of a Islamic revolutionary nationalist movement that first emerged in the 1930s in Indonesia, helped lead Indonesia to independence against the Dutch, fought the Japanese, The leader of it was executed by Sukarno, and a militant brand grew up during the 1970s, founded by two clerics whose ancestors were from the Hadramat. That's the same area where bin Laden's father came from. The Hadramatis have been in that part of the world for 400 or 500 years. There's a huge network of kinship relations and commercial relations among Arab seafarers that have been to that part of the world for hundreds of years. And Al-Qaeda and the Al-Qaeda movement is parasitic on those pre-existing relationships. Well, within this movement, there was a split between the so-called Sufis, and this goes back to the Hadramat back 400 or 500 years, and those who wanted a Salafi version of the Darul Islam. That is, no music, no mysticism, no metaphorical interpretations of God. Very similar to the splits between the iconoclasts and the Catholics in the 9th and 10th century in Western Europe. They originally modeled themselves on the Jamaat Islami, which was one of these Takfiri groups that emerged in Egypt in the 1980s under the spiritual guidance of the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel-Rahman, who's now in prison in the United States for helping to plan blowing up New York City landmarks. Well, the Egyptian Islamic group hasn't done anything in years because after the Luxor massacres in the late 1990s, their relatives and friends in the Upper Egypt, where they were from, basically said, hold off, this is enough, we don't want any more of this. Since then, there's not a peep out of these guys. But this had split off with the other group, headed by Zawahiri, who was no longer embedded in his society, who was now in Afghanistan, and who basically became more apocalyptic in his vision, saying, let's carry out any attack possible, and who cares about retaliation. So at this time, the Jamaat Islamiyah, who had been part of the jihad against the Soviets, decided to ally itself with bin Laden. This is about the time that the original Islamic group, on which they had been modeled, decided to basically call everything off. And they slowly developed an organization in 1988, 1989, when they were invited back, when they came back after Suharto's fall, that became increasingly Takfiri. After Sunkar's death, the founder of the Jamaat Islamiyah died in 1999. His sidekick Abu Bakr Bashir took over. And Bashir was sort of an oracular leader. He wasn't an operational, hands-on guy. And so he allowed, in a sense, the Takfiris within the group to emerge. Now, almost all descriptions of the Jamaat Islamiyah are based on this sort of hierarchical descriptions that you get officially through the Jamaat Islamiyah movement or through the intelligence analysts or through the paper. Now, we've worked a long time among our consultants as the head of Australian intelligence who tracked the Jamaat Islamiyah. We work closely with the strike team leaders of the Indonesian government who've tracked these guys. And we have I can't say in our University of Michigan payroll, but as consultants, guys who were former leaders of the Jamaat Islamiyah. And I spent some time interviewing the emir in prison in Jakarta in 2005. And this is what we find. The organization predicts nothing. There are four things that predict who will belong to an attack group and the likelihood that they'll continue to belong to an attack group. The first is what class during the Soviet-Afghan War and in the original in the immediate aftermath did they graduate from. They would go to the Abu Sayyaf training camp near Peshawar, beginning in 1986 with Zulkarnain, who was the sort of military leader of the Jamaat Islamiyah. And depending on the year and their cohort, they would form groups that kept together ever since. The second greatest predictor is marriages. And this we find again and again. There are 30 marriages, distributed over 10 attacks. And think about it. You know, these films like The Godfather, where you see all these plots being hatched in the marriage at the beginning of the film, that's exactly how it happens. Because marriages are great places to hatch plots, much better than mosques. Because you got everybody there, they're all relaxed, they can talk about whatever they want, no one's really listening. Great place to do jihad. The third greatest predictor is actual kinship relationships. Brothers, sisters, cousins. These are the clusters, family clusters of some of the principal actors in the attacks of the Jamaah Islamiyah. These are the family ties over different attacks. AE is the Australian embassy bombing. Bali is the Bali attack of 2002, the second greatest terrorist attack after 9/11. PAR is the bombing of the Philippines ambassador's residence in 2000. And you can see again, there are some thick family ties running through these things. This is just the family ties in one particular attack. The Bali bombing of 2002 is perhaps the most interesting because it's the most lethal and the most famous attack. It's what made people aware that Jamaah Islamiyah existed. I mean, these guys had been existing for some time, and even the intelligence authorities didn't even know they were around. Again, because in a little bit like drug cartels or even gangs, it's family groups.